The handcuffs clicked around my wrists before I had a chance to touch my wife's coffin. I was standing less than 3 feet from Eleanor when my own son stepped in front of me. "Dad," Daniel said loudly enough for the entire chapel to hear, "you need to stop. Please don't make this harder for everyone." I stared at him, not understanding what he was talking about. Then 2 police officers walked through the front doors. One of them looked directly at me. "Thomas Whitmore?" "Yes. We've received a report concerning your mental condition and possible risk of disruptive behavior. We need you to come with us." For a moment, I thought they had made a mistake. I looked at Daniel. He didn't look surprised. He looked prepared. "My name is Thomas Whitmore. I'm 71 years old, and I buried my wife of 46 years 3 days ago. Or at least I tried to." The morning of the funeral had begun with silence. The kind of silence that settles into a house after the only person who ever filled it with warmth is gone. Eleanor had been dead for exactly 72 hours. Cancer had taken her slowly, then all at once. For 8 months I slept in a chair beside her hospital bed. I learned the sound of every machine. I learned which nurses whispered and which ones lied. I learned that the strongest woman I had ever known could still smile while planning her own funeral. She made me promise one thing. "Don't let grief make you weak, Tom." I promised. I meant it. I had no idea that the first battle after her death would be against our own son. Daniel wasn't always like this. He was the boy who used to follow me through the cemetery carrying tools that were too heavy for him. Eleanor and I built Whitmore Memorial together. People think cemeteries are about death. They're wrong. They're about promises. About families. About making sure someone is remembered with dignity. For 40 years we built a business that cared for the dead and protected the living. When I turned 68, I stepped back from daily operations. Daniel became president of the company. I thought I was giving him a future. Instead, I was giving him access. The funeral chapel was filled with nearly 200 people. Pastors. Veterans. Families we had served for decades. Employees who had worked with Eleanor longer than Daniel had been alive. I walked toward her coffin holding a single white rose. Then Daniel blocked my path. His wife, Melissa, stood beside him with tears running down her face. Perfect tears. Practiced tears. "Dad, you've been confused all week," Daniel said. "You've forgotten conversations. You've been agitated. Please." "What are you talking about?" He turned toward the guests. "This is exactly what I was afraid of." The room became painfully quiet. I heard whispers. I heard someone say, "Poor Mr. Whitmore." Or, I had buried strangers with more dignity than my own family was giving me. The officers approached carefully. "Sir, we're not here to embarrass you. You're already doing that." One officer glanced at a folder in his hand. "There's a signed medical concern statement and a request for emergency evaluation." "Signed by who?" He hesitated, then looked at Daniel. I felt something inside me turn cold. Not grief. Recognition. Betrayal has a different temperature. It doesn't burn. It freezes. I looked around the chapel. No one moved. No one spoke. People who had known me for decades watched as if I had suddenly become a stranger. Daniel stepped closer. "Dad, please cooperate." I asked him one question. "Did you do this today?" His eyes dropped for half a second. That was enough. The officers gently took my arms. I didn't resist. I refused to give Daniel the scene he wanted. As they led me toward the door, I looked back at Eleanor's coffin. The white rose was still in my hand. I placed it on the floor beside the aisle. I was not allowed to say goodbye to my wife. Outside, cameras were already waiting. Someone had called the local news. An elderly funeral director removed from his own wife's funeral. It would make a neat headline. At the station they asked me simple questions. My name, the date, the president, whether I knew where I was. I answered everything clearly. After 3 hours, a physician examined me. He looked at the paperwork, then looked at me. Mr. Whitmore, he said quietly, I don't believe you're suffering from dementia. Then why am I here? He closed the folder. That's a question for whoever sent you. I was released that afternoon. No apology. No explanation. Just a recommendation to follow up with my family. My family. I drove home in silence. When I reached the house, I knew something was wrong immediately. The front gate code had been changed. My key no longer fit the front door. I stood there for nearly a minute before noticing a legal envelope taped to the door. It was from Daniel's attorney. The letter stated that, due to concerns regarding my cognitive health, I was being temporarily restricted from accessing certain family properties and financial accounts until a competency review could be completed. I read it twice. Then a third time. I had built that house. Every brick. Every beam. Eleanor had planted the oak tree in the front yard the year Daniel was born. Now I was being treated like a trespasser. I walked around to the garage. The side entrance still opened with the old mechanical key. Daniel had forgotten that lock. Inside, the house smelled like Eleanor's lavender soap. I stood in the kitchen and finally allowed myself to cry. Not because of the handcuffs. Not because of the humiliation. Because the last place Eleanor had stood was now a battlefield. I remembered something she had said 6 months earlier. If anything ever feels wrong after I'm gone, check the study. At the time I thought she was talking about insurance papers. I went upstairs. The study was untouched. Her reading glasses were still on the desk. The fountain pen she loved was beside a stack of unopened sympathy cards. In the wall safe, behind the property records, was a small black folder. On top of it lay a sealed envelope with my name written in Eleanor's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single page. It read, Tom, if Daniel ever turns against you, open the black folder first. I've been preparing for this longer than you know. I stared at the words. Then I opened the folder. The first document inside made my blood run cold. Eleanor had not only expected my son's betrayal. She had left behind a plan. I read Eleanor's letter 3 times before I opened the black folder. Her handwriting was steady. No fear. No panic. Just certainty. That frightened me more than anything. Eleanor had always noticed things before I did. She could walk into a room, watch people for 5 minutes, and quietly tell me who was lying. She had been right so many times that I eventually stopped asking how she knew. I simply listened. The first document was a trust agreement. Not a draft. A finalized legal document. Whitmore Memorial Trust. Dated 14 months earlier. I frowned. I had signed dozens of corporate papers over the years, but I had never seen this version. The second page answered my question. Eleanor had transferred ownership of the cemetery land, the funeral chapel, and several investment properties into the trust. The sole acting trustee was me. Not Daniel. Me. I sat down slowly. Daniel had become president of the company, but he did not control the trust. The trust controlled the land, the buildings, the memorial properties, almost everything that actually mattered. A yellow note was attached to the next document. In Eleanor's handwriting. Daniel believes he owns the future. He only controls the office. My phone rang. Richard Hale. I hadn't spoken to him since Eleanor's funeral arrangements. Richard had been our attorney for over 30 years. He answered before I could say hello. Tom, where are you? At the house. Stay there. I'm coming. He arrived 40 minutes later carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the same gray suit he had worn to the funeral. When he saw the black folder on the table, he stopped. She told you. She expected this. Richard looked tired. No. She prepared for it. He opened the folder carefully. She came to my office last year. She said Daniel had started asking unusual questions. What kind of questions? Property titles, trust structures, guardianship laws. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. She was worried. She was cautious. There's a difference. Richard removed another envelope from the folder. These are copies. The originals are secured. Inside were banking records, corporate authorizations, power of attorney requests. Most had Daniel's signature. Some had mine. Except they weren't mine. I knew my own signature. These were excellent forgeries. Richard placed a document in front of me. Look at the date. It was signed 3 weeks before Eleanor died. I remembered that week clearly. I had barely left the hospital. I had certainly never visited a law office. He forged this. Richard nodded. He tried to obtain authority over trust assets. I looked at him. Can he? He can try. Richard hesitated before continuing. There's something else. He handed me a thin medical file. At the top was the name of a neurologist. Beneath it was a recommendation for cognitive evaluation. My name. A diagnosis of probable early dementia. I stared at the page. I've never met this doctor. I know. Richard's expression hardened. The report was requested by Daniel. The room became very quiet. The handcuffs. The police. The funeral. None of it had been impulsive. It had been organized. Step by step. How long has this been happening? Richard looked out the window for a moment. Longer than either of us wanted to believe. He opened his briefcase and removed a small digital recorder. I received this yesterday. He pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the kitchen. Once the competency petition is approved, the trust becomes manageable through court supervision. Another voice answered. A man. Come. Professional. The judge will want medical documentation. We're working on that. The recording ended. I felt physically sick. My own son was discussing my life as if I were already gone. What do we do? Richard looked directly at me. We move before he does. He spread several documents across the table. First, we freeze any attempt to alter the trust. Second, we challenge the medical report. Third. He stopped. There's one person Eleanor insisted we contact if this ever happened. He slid a business card toward me. Margaret Collins. Executive Director. Whitmore Memorial Cemetery. I knew Margaret. She had worked with Eleanor for 22 years. She's been waiting for your call. I picked up the card. Before I could dial, my phone buzzed again. A notification from my bank. Access denied. Primary accounts suspended pending legal review. Daniel had moved faster than I thought. Richard stood. Tom. Yes. He made one mistake. What mistake? Richard held up the forged document. He forged Eleanor's signature too. I looked at the page again. This time I noticed the date. It was signed 2 days after Eleanor had lost the ability to hold a pen. Richard closed the folder. That doesn't just make this fraud. He looked me straight in the eyes. It makes it criminal. And for the first time since the handcuffs closed around my wrists, I stopped feeling like a grieving husband. I started feeling like a man whose wife had left him the blueprint for a war. Margaret Collins opened the cemetery gates herself. She didn't ask questions. She simply looked at my face, stepped aside, and said, "I've been expecting you." The morning air smelled of fresh grass and wet stone. I had walked these grounds thousands of times, but that day they felt different. Quieter. Almost watchful. Margaret led me into the small administrative building behind the chapel. On her desk sat 3 thick archive boxes. Eleanor's name was written across each one. "She told me to keep these off the company records," Margaret said. "She said that if anything happened to her, Daniel would search the office first." I looked at the boxes. She planned all this? She planned for the possibility. Margaret opened the first box. Inside were copies of land surveys, trust amendments, and correspondence with city officials. One map caught my attention immediately. A red line ran directly across the eastern edge of our cemetery property. "What is this?" Margaret slid the map toward me. "The state highway expansion." I frowned. I thought that project was years away. It was. She opened another folder. 3 months ago it was accelerated. The highway would pass within a quarter-mile of our land. Commercial zoning would follow. Property values would increase dramatically. I felt a cold realization settle over me. Daniel hadn't tried to take the business because it was failing. He was trying to take the land before its value became public. How much? Margaret hesitated. Conservative estimate? $8 to $10 million. I looked at the map again. The cemetery. The chapel. The surrounding acreage. Eleanor had protected all of it. Margaret opened the second box. "These are copies of Daniel's requests. Letters. Emails. Internal memos. For over a year he had repeatedly asked for complete ownership records. Trust access. Title transfers. He had even requested permission to meet privately with developers. Eleanor refused every time," Margaret said. "She never told me. She didn't want you to choose between your wife and your son." That sounded exactly like Eleanor. She had always carried the heavier burden quietly. Margaret reached into the final box and removed a small flash drive. "This is the part she wanted you to hear." She plugged it into her computer. A recording began. Daniel's voice. Clear. Confident. "We need control before the appraisal becomes public." Another voice answered. A woman. "Melissa. What about the trust?" "He still thinks I'm handling the business honestly." "And your father?" A pause. "Once he's declared incompetent, the court can appoint a conservator." Melissa laughed softly. "He'll never know what happened." The recording ended. I stared at the screen. For a long moment I couldn't speak. My son wasn't grieving his mother. He was timing her death. Margaret quietly handed me a tissue. I hadn't realized my eyes were wet. "I'm sorry, Tom. I should have seen it." "No," she said firmly. "You loved him. There are mistakes made from ignorance. And there are mistakes made from love. The second kind hurts more." My phone buzzed. "Richard." I just got a copy of the competency petition, he said. They're asking the court for emergency conservatorship. How soon? 5 days. I looked at Margaret. We don't have much time. No, Richard replied. And there's something worse. What? They've already scheduled a meeting with a development company. The line went silent for a moment. Tom. Yes. If they sign a preliminary agreement before we stop them, this becomes much more complicated. After the call ended, Margaret opened one last folder. Inside was a single sealed envelope. Eleanor's handwriting again. For Tom only. I opened it carefully. The letter was short. If you're reading this, then Daniel has crossed the line I hoped he never would. Don't fight him with anger. Fight him with truth. The cemetery remembers everything. So do the records. Attached to the letter was a handwritten list of names. Lawyers. Bank officers. A retired judge. And one name circled twice. Victor Shaw, chairman of the Whitmore Memorial Board. Margaret looked at me. Eleanor met with Victor 6 months ago. About Daniel? She told him that if you ever called, he was to believe you before anyone else. I folded the letter carefully. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something stronger than grief. Purpose. Daniel thought he was fighting an old man who had lost his wife. He had no idea he was fighting a husband who had been left instructions by the woman who knew him better than anyone alive. As I walked out of the office, I looked across the rows of white headstones. The cemetery had always been the place where families came after betrayal, regret, and loss. I never imagined it would become the place where my own family's secrets were buried. My phone buzzed again. A new voicemail. It was Daniel. Dad, please don't make this difficult. The hearing is just a formality. I listened to his voice twice. Then I deleted it. The hearing was in 5 days. But the war had already started, and I was done defending myself. It was time to expose him. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid. Because I finally understood what Eleanor had been protecting. By sunrise, Richard Hale had assembled a conference room full of people Daniel never expected to see on my side. Victor Shaw arrived first. At 76, he still carried himself like the judge he had once been. He had served on the Whitmore Memorial Board for nearly 20 years. He shook my hand firmly. Eleanor told me this day might come. Richard placed the forged documents on the table. Victor read them silently. When he finished, he removed his glasses. He forged both signatures. Richard nodded, and filed a competency petition based on a fraudulent medical report. Victor's expression didn't change. That's not a family dispute. He looked directly at me. That's a criminal conspiracy. By noon we had a plan. Daniel believed the upcoming court hearing would give him legal control over my affairs. He also believed the board meeting scheduled for the following evening was a formality. He expected to be confirmed as permanent president of Whitmore Memorial. He had no idea that Victor had quietly called an emergency executive session. The meeting would include every voting board member, our bank representative, the trust administrator, and the company's outside auditors. Richard leaned across the table. We don't stop him in court. I frowned. What do you mean? We let him walk into the room believing he has already won. That was exactly the kind of strategy Eleanor would have approved of. Truth is most powerful when someone has stopped expecting it. The next morning Daniel called me. I answered. His voice was calm, concerned, perfectly rehearsed. Dad, I've been trying to reach you. I know. This competency hearing isn't meant to hurt you. I looked out the kitchen window at the empty garden Eleanor had loved. Is that what you tell yourself? A pause. You're confused. No. You've been making irrational decisions. I almost laughed. You had me arrested at my wife's funeral. Silence. Then he spoke softly. We were trying to protect you. Protect me. That word nearly broke me. Because once, when he was 6 years old, he had hidden behind my legs during a thunderstorm. He had looked up at me and asked, "Dad, you'll protect us, right?" I had said yes without hesitation. Now he was using that same word while trying to take my life apart piece by piece. "I'll see you tomorrow," I said. He sounded relieved. "I'm glad you're cooperating." After the call ended, Richard looked at me. "He believes you're surrendering." Good. That afternoon we met with the trust administrator, a woman named Elaine Mercer. She had managed Whitmore Memorial Trust for 11 years. When she reviewed the forged documents, she became unusually quiet. "What is it?" I asked. She pointed to one paragraph. "He made another mistake." "What mistake?" "He tried to transfer restricted memorial land." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Elaine opened the original trust agreement. Eleanor included a preservation clause. She turned to the relevant page. The cemetery land cannot be sold, transferred, or developed without unanimous approval from the board and the acting trustee. That's me. Yes. Daniel had spent months negotiating a sale he could never legally complete. He hadn't read the trust carefully enough. Or perhaps he had assumed I would be declared incompetent before anyone noticed. Elaine looked at me. "Your wife was extraordinarily thorough." She had always been. Late that evening Richard received a call. The development company had confirmed a private signing ceremony. Tomorrow. Immediately after the board meeting. Daniel intended to announce both his appointment and the land sale on the same day. He was planning a celebration. Victor smiled for the first time. Then we should give him an audience. The board meeting was held in the old Memorial Hall, the same building where Eleanor and I had hosted community remembrance ceremonies for decades. By the time I arrived, every seat was occupied. Board members, senior employees, bank officials, even a representative from the development company. Daniel stood near the front wearing a navy suit. Melissa beside him. When he saw me enter, surprise flashed across his face. Then he smiled. A confident smile. He walked toward me. "I'm glad you came." "So am I." He lowered his voice. "Dad, after today this can finally be resolved peacefully." I looked at him carefully. He genuinely believed he was about to inherit everything. Victor called the meeting to order. Daniel gave a polished presentation. He spoke about modernization, expansion, financial opportunity. He described the future Eleanor would have wanted. People applauded politely. Then Victor stood. "Before the board votes," he said, "there is one matter that must be addressed." Daniel's smile faded slightly. Victor looked toward Richard. "Counselor." Richard stood and placed a sealed envelope on the table. "This meeting has been recorded from the moment it began." Daniel frowned. "What is this?" Richard didn't answer. He simply looked at me. I reached into my briefcase, removed Eleanor's black folder, and placed it beside the envelope. Daniel stared at it. His face changed instantly. For the first time since the funeral, I saw something I had not seen in my son's eyes. Fear. Victor looked around the room. Tomorrow's court hearing will not determine who controls Whitmore Memorial. He paused. Because tonight we are going to determine who has been trying to steal it. The room fell completely silent, and Daniel suddenly realized that the meeting he thought would crown him had become his trial. Daniel looked at the black folder as if he had seen a ghost. His confidence disappeared so quickly that several people in the room noticed it before I said a single word. Victor Shaw remained standing. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "the floor is yours." I walked to the front of the room carrying Eleanor's folder. My hands were steady. Grief had already taken everything it could take from me. Now there was only truth. 46 years ago, I began, my wife and I started this company with one hearse, one chapel, and a loan we could barely afford. I looked at Daniel. We built it together. Everything I ever planned was meant to become yours one day. His eyes stayed fixed on the folder. But inheritance requires trust. I opened the first section. These are the original trust documents. Richard distributed copies to every board member. Murmurs spread across the room. Victor looked at the pages carefully. The acting trustee is Thomas Whitmore. Yes. The trust controls the cemetery land. Yes. Daniel finally spoke. This doesn't change anything. I looked at him. It changes everything. Richard stood. We have obtained certified forensic analysis confirming that Mr. Daniel Whitmore forged both Thomas Whitmore's and Eleanor Whitmore's signatures. He placed enlarged copies of the documents on the screen behind us. The differences were subtle. Pressure patterns, stroke angles, letter spacing. The forensic report was unmistakable. Daniel's attorney rose immediately. This is a family disagreement. Richard calmly pressed a button. The speakers came alive. Daniel's voice filled the hall. Once the competency petition is approved, the trust becomes manageable through court supervision. Melissa answered. He'll never know what happened. The recording ended. No one spoke. Richard played the second recording. Daniel discussing the land sale, the highway expansion, the expected increase in value, the plan to secure ownership before the appraisal became public. When the audio stopped, Victor looked directly at Daniel. Is that your voice? Daniel remained silent. The development company representative slowly closed his briefcase. He looked deeply uncomfortable. Richard turned to the board. The proposed land transaction violates the preservation clause unanimously approved by this board and personally signed by Eleanor Whitmore. He held up the agreement. The sale was legally impossible. Daniel's face had gone completely pale. You manipulated the board, Richard continued. You submitted forged authorizations. You obtained a fraudulent medical report. And you initiated a competency proceeding based on fabricated evidence. Daniel stood abruptly. My father has been unstable for months. I looked at him quietly. Then why did you wait until your mother died? The question hung in the room. He had no answer. Victor removed his glasses. I knew Eleanor for 25 years. His voice was calm. She anticipated that this might happen. He turned toward the board. She instructed me that if Thomas ever appeared with this folder, we were to protect the trust exactly as written. One board member after another began speaking. People Daniel had assumed were loyal to him. They weren't. They had been loyal to Whitmore Memorial. Victor called for a vote. All authority previously delegated to Daniel Whitmore is hereby revoked. Every hand went up. Even the members Daniel had personally appointed. The vote was unanimous. Daniel looked around the room in disbelief. You're making a mistake. Victor answered immediately. No. He looked at the documents. We're correcting one. At that moment the doors opened. 2 state investigators entered with a woman carrying a case file. Richard had already notified them. The forged signatures. The false medical documentation. The attempted conservatorship. The financial records. Everything had been delivered that morning. One investigator approached Daniel. Mr. Whitmore, we need to speak with you regarding allegations of fraud, forgery, and financial misconduct. Melissa stepped backward. I didn't know. The investigator looked at her. We'll determine that. Daniel turned to me. Dad. It was the first time that day he had called me that. Not Mr. Whitmore. Not the trustee. Dad, you're really doing this? I looked at him for a long time. You did this. The investigators escorted him out of the hall. No shouting. No dramatic struggle. Just the quiet collapse of a man who believed greed could replace character. When the doors closed, the room remained silent. Victor walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. She saved you. I nodded. She saved what we built. The next morning the court dismissed the competency petition entirely. The neurologist who had signed the report lost his medical license pending investigation. The development agreement was cancelled. The trust remained intact. Several months later, I visited Eleanor's grave alone. I brought another white rose. The same kind I had never been allowed to place beside her coffin. I knelt and set it gently on the stone. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. A breeze moved through the cemetery. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something close to peace. Not victory. Peace. Because revenge ends when someone suffers. Justice ends when the truth is protected. I looked across the rows of headstones. Families came here to remember promises. And Eleanor had kept the last promise she ever made me. She had made sure I would never have to beg my own son for my dignity. If this story taught me anything, it's this. The deepest betrayals rarely come from strangers. They come from the people who know exactly where your heart is buried. Protect your kindness. Protect your legacy. And never mistake love for blindness. Some foundations are built from concrete. The strongest ones are built from truth. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If it meant something to you, let me know where you're watching from. And remember this. The people who try to bury you are often standing on the ground you built for them.